Hey kiddos! In this video I will be reading 2 more chapters from Magic Tree House number 31, Summer of the Sea Serpent. Remember where we left off? Kathleen and Teddy had turned back into seals and they went down and found the sword, and then they came up to the surface and they barked to get the attention of Jack and Annie, who swam down, and we left off where they saw the sword down under the water. So if you are following along at home, we are on chapter 9, which is titled The Sword of Light, and chapter 9 begins on page 72. Okay? Annie pointed to the sword handle. Jack nodded, but he was running out of air. He swam back up to the surface, and Annie followed him. Their heads bobbed above the water, and they gasped. "Did you see it?" cried Annie. "The handle of the sword." "Yes, the blade must be buried in the sand," said Jack. "We have to pull it out," said Annie, "and we have to hurry." "Right," said Jack. He and Annie took giant gulps of air. Then they swam back down to the bottom of the cove. Jack got to the sword first. He grabbed the handle and pulled, but the sword didn't budge. He pulled again, but the sword didn't move. Annie grabbed one side of the handle, and she and Jack pulled together. Jack felt the sword move a tiny bit. His lungs felt like they were about to burst. Gripping his side of the handle with both hands, Jack pulled with all of his might, and then suddenly the flashing blade slipped out of the sand. Jack and Annie carried the sword up through the water as fast as they could. They burst into the air, clinging to the sword of light and gasping for air. "We got it!" Jack called to Kathleen and Teddy. The seals circled around them, splashing and barking joyfully. "Bark, bark, 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 bark." "Lead us to the rocks," Annie shouted. Jack and Annie each held onto the sword's handle with one hand, paddling their feet and their free hands and dragging the sword after the seals. And here's a pretty cool picture of when they went down and they grabbed the sword and pulled it out together. As they swam, the fog began to lift and the sky turned from gray to blue. By the time they reached the rocky island, light from the late afternoon sun was again glinting off the strange green shoreline. "Hold the sword while I get out," Jack shouted to Annie. Jack climbed onto the rocky island. He took the sword from Annie, then carefully pulled it up onto the rocks and laid it on its side. Annie climbed out of the water. Nearby, Teddy and Kathleen poked up their seal heads. They were silent as they stared in wonder at the sword. "Wow," breathed Annie. Jack nodded. The mighty sword reflected the burning light of the setting sun. Its blade glowed as if it too were on fire. "Now what do we do?" Jack said. "We have to get the sword to Merlin fast," said Annie. "The sun's about to go down." "Right," said Jack, "before nightfall. Right." Suddenly Teddy and Kathleen barked a warning, and Jack and Annie looked up. The water had begun to ripple. The ripple started at the edge of the cove and swelled toward the center. Waves crashed against the small rocky island, sending up great showers of spray. "What's going on?" said Jack. "Maybe a bad storm's coming," said Annie. "Bark, bark!" Kathleen and Teddy tried to haul themselves onto the rocks, but the waves pushed them away. "We've got to help them," said Annie. She and Jack tried to help the seals out of the rough water. Their hands slipped over the sleek sealskin, and they nearly toppled into the water themselves. The waves kept rolling and splashing. "Bark, bark!" The 2 seals were swept away from the rocky island. "Look!" cried Annie. "The land is moving!" Jack looked at the strange green shoreline surrounding the cove. It was moving. It shifted from side to side, and then it slithered forward. A great roaring noise rocked the cove. A monstrous head rose above the surface of the water. The green hills were not hills at all. They were the coils of a giant sea serpent's body. It kind of reminds me of the movie Moana. Have you ever seen that movie? When the island turns into the great monster lady person thing? Anyway, if you haven't seen it, that's a scene in the movie that kind of reminded me of that. Anyway, back to Magic Tree House. Chapter 10, The Ancient Question. "Ah!" Jack screamed, and Annie screamed too, and the giant sea serpent arched its long neck into the sky. Its scaly green skin glistened in the late sunlight, staring at Jack and Annie, its eyes burning like yellow lamps. Jack and Annie froze with terror. The monster opened its mouth, and inside were hideous fangs and purple forked tongue. The serpent made a terrible hissing sound. Jack and Annie huddled together on the rock. Frantic seal barks came from far away. "Teddy!" yelled Jack. "Kathleen! mean? Their magic can't help us now, cried Annie. They're stuck in their seal. But before she could finish, the sea serpent's deep voice boomed through the cove. Who are you? And why are you stealing the sword of light? Jack was too stunned to answer, but Annie shouted back at the monster, We're Jack and Annie, and we're on a mission for Merlin! The serpent hissed angrily. Its purple tongue flicked as its coiled body surrounded the rocky island. The monster arched its neck and lowered its huge head. Again, the ancient voice boomed through the cove. To be worthy of the sword, you must answer the question of the sword. What is the question? Shouted Annie. The serpent hissed, and it turned away and circled the rocks again. Soon its scaly green body was coiled twice around the rocky island. It's going to crush us, Jack thought in horror. Maybe they have the strength enough to stab the monster before it squashed them. Pick up the sword, he shouted to Annie. Together, Jack and Annie lifted the mighty sword, and they gripped its handle and pointed its gleaming blade at the serpent. Don't come any closer, Jack yelled. The serpent came closer. Its eyes flashed, and its forked tongue darted out at them. It opened its mouth wide. Wait, stop, Annie shouted at the sea serpent. Give us a chance. Ask the question. The serpent closed its mouth. Then it arched its neck, and its huge head dipped down right in front of Jack and Annie. In a low, deep voice it said, What is the purpose of the sword? That is the ancient question. Oh, wow, look at this picture, boys and girls. Can you imagine? How scary would that be? Okay, the purpose of the sword. Just a minute, shouted Annie. She turned to Jack. What is the purpose of the sword? She asked. To defeat your enemies? Jack said. Annie shook her head. That doesn't sound right. To force them to give up, Jack said. To slay them? No, I'm sure that's not right, said Annie. The serpent hissed at them impatiently. Then what? Said Jack. I don't know, said Annie, but maybe it's not about fighting at all. Look at it. Jack stared at the gleaming sword. Its silver blade glowed against the red sunset sky. Staring at the wondrous sword, Jack felt calmer. A strange sense of joy and relief came over him. Answer the question, the serpent boomed. Jack's mind became clear. I think I've got it, he said. Remember the line from Merlin's rhyme? Answer a question with love, not fear? Yes, said Annie. That's it. It's not about fighting at all. It's about not being afraid. Answer the question, the serpent boomed again. Jack looked at the serpent's face. As he stared deep into its yellow eyes, he no longer felt any fear. It was the serpent who seemed afraid now. The sword should not be used to harm anyone or anything, Jack shouted. That's right, said Annie. It should be used for good only. The serpent stopped swaying and flicked its tongue. The sword should not make people afraid, said Jack. It should help take away their fear. If they're not afraid, they'll stop fighting. The serpent was very still. The purpose of the sword is not fighting, Jack shouted. The purpose of the sword is peace. And we're going to stop there. I wonder if they're right, boys and girls. We'll find out tomorrow when we read the last 2 chapters. I hope you enjoyed today's chapters. Bye.